In the dim light of the evening, Ava's small hands trembled as she traced a simple drawing on the crumpled piece of paper. The image wasn't elaborate, just a plate of food, a bowl of soup, some rice and bread. She stared at it, as if imagining the warmth of the meal she would never taste. A thin layer of dust and grime coated her fingers, but she paid it no mind. Hunger gnawed at her from the inside, and her mind wandered to the empty spaces in her stomach where a meal should have been. She had no mother to comfort her, no father to feed her. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the broken window and the distant echoes of a war she had no part in, yet she suffered from it more than anyone could understand. She was alone, abandoned by a world that forgot to care, with nothing but a sketch of food to soothe her gnawing hunger. Ava's eyes welled up with tears as the cold crept deeper into her bones. She wiped her eyes on the sleeve of her ragged coat, smudging the dirt that had settled there. The shadows seemed to press in on her, threatening to swallow her whole. Before we begin, let me know where you are watching from. Leave your country name in the comments below. And if you love stories about courage, loyalty, and community, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. That's when the sound of paws caught her attention. She froze. It was the rhythmic tap-tap of something coming closer. The soldier didn't make a sound, but his canine companion, Shadow, moved with grace beside him, alert to every noise, every change in the air. Ethan Cole, a soldier with a hardened heart, kneeled down beside his dog and spoke softly. "Stay here, Shadow. Let's see if we can help." Ava barely noticed him at first, too absorbed in her misery, but the dog's soft whine broke through her fog of despair. She glanced up, meeting the kind eyes of the soldier, his face worn with exhaustion, but filled with a quiet determination. His uniform was dirty, and his expression haunted, but there was something in the way he approached her, something in the way his hand reached out to her, that told her he wasn't here to harm. "Ava," he said gently, as if the name had meaning. "Are you all right?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to the drawing, a silent plea for understanding. The soldier looked at it for a moment, then his eyes softened. "You're hungry, aren't you?" Ava nodded, her voice caught in her throat. Ethan glanced at Shadow, who sat at his side, watching Ava with understanding in his canine eyes. The bond between them was unspoken but clear. They had both seen too much. The world had taken its toll on them, but somehow it hadn't stripped them of their ability to care. Ethan reached into his bag and pulled out a small, sealed packet of food, his face tightening with guilt. This is all I have left, but I think you need it more than I do." He handed it to her, and for a long moment they both stood there in silence, the weight of the gesture hanging between them. Ava took the packet, her fingers brushing against his. For the first time in weeks, her heart lightened just a little. But just as quickly as the moment of tenderness had come, a sudden rustle from behind startled them both. Ava's heart skipped a beat, and she turned her head in fear. The shadows around them seemed to grow darker, the danger lurking ever closer. Ethan's expression hardened, his instincts kicking in. "There's something out there," he murmured, scanning the area, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. But before he could act, the storm clouds overhead began to roll in, thick and heavy, a warning of something far worse than a mere threat. The wind began to howl, a sharp, bitter gust that cut through the air like a blade. Ethan and Ava stood in the face of the storm, the tension between them growing as the sky darkened. Shadow growled softly, his ears pinned back, as if he too sensed the danger closing in. "Stay close," Ethan commanded, his voice low and steady. He had seen too many dangers to be unprepared. His military instincts kicked in, every sense heightened, scanning the horizon for movement. The storm, the shadows, everything felt wrong. Ava, still clutching the packet of food, glanced at Ethan with wide eyes. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She had known nothing but fear for as long as she could remember. The war, the hunger, the pain, it was all she had ever known. But now, as the world seemed to tighten around them, it felt different. This wasn't just another cold night. There was something else. Ethan's sharp gaze landed on a figure in the distance, a shadow moving steadily towards them. It wasn't the weather or the storm playing tricks on his mind. Someone, or something, was out there, drawing closer. "Stay behind me," he ordered. Shadow stood guard, sensing the tension in his handler's voice, ready to protect. Ava's pulse raced as she looked at the soldier, the fear in her eyes a mirror of his own. She had no idea who or what was approaching, but instinct told her to listen. She clutched the packet of food closer to her chest and backed up a few steps, her heart pounding. The figure grew clearer, emerging from the fog and rain like a ghost from the mist. It wasn't a soldier or a friendly face. It was a man, ragged, disheveled, his eyes wild and filled with desperation. He stumbled forward, his body shaking, his movements erratic. Ethan immediately raised his weapon, the barrel pointed toward the man. "Halt! Stay where you are!" The man didn't respond, his eyes darting to Ethan, then to Ava, then to the ground. There was something unnatural about the way he moved, something that set Ethan on edge. "Don't shoot," Ava pleaded, stepping forward despite the soldier's warning. The man's eyes flickered towards her, and for the first time, his frantic movements slowed. His gaze softened, just for a moment, as if seeing her somehow grounded him. Ethan didn't lower his weapon but felt a strange pull inside him. He had been trained to eliminate threats, to neutralize danger, but there was something about this man, this desperate soul, that made him hesitate. He wasn't sure if it was the storm or the way Ava's pleading voice carried a weight that no child's voice should ever bear. But in that moment, he lowered the gun slightly, the tension in his body easing. "Ava, get back," he murmured. But the girl, who had seen so much suffering in her short life, didn't budge. Her empathy was stronger than her fear. She had lived through things no child should endure, but she had also learned that kindness, even in the smallest measure, could make a difference. The man finally spoke, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. I have nothing left," he muttered. "They took everything. Everyone's gone. I'm alone." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. It was the same pain he had seen in too many faces, soldiers, civilians, those who had lost everything. And for a moment, the soldier saw something in this man's eyes that mirrored his own loneliness. The weight of his past, of his own struggles, flooded back to him. "Ava, we can help him," Ethan said quietly, his voice softer now. "We can help each other." The man looked at Ethan, confusion clouding his gaze. "Help? How? There's no one left." "There's always someone," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Even if it's just the two of us, we'll find a way. We always do." Shadow moved closer to the man, nudging him gently with his nose, sensing his pain. The man flinched, but then slowly, cautiously, he reached down to pet the dog. The warmth of the dog's touch seemed to break through some of the darkness in his soul, and for a moment the soldier and his canine stood by, allowing the bond between the man and the dog to take root. Ava, standing silently behind Ethan, felt the stirrings of something within her. A small seed of hope, fragile but real, began to grow in her heart. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't facing it alone. As the storm raged on above them, the four of them, Ethan, Ava, Shadow, and the stranger, stood together in the midst of it all, united in the silent promise of survival. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. But just as the storm seemed to calm, a new sound reached their ears, a faint, distant cry growing louder by the second. The noise sent a chill down Ethan's spine. It wasn't just the wind or the storm, it was something worse, something more ominous. The cry echoed through the wind, a sharp, eerie sound that sent a chill down the spine of everyone present. The stranger tensed at the noise, his eyes widening with fear as he stepped backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. Ethan's hand instinctively went back to his weapon. He didn't draw it yet, but his fingers hovered over the grip, ready for whatever was coming. Shadow growled low, his fur bristling, his body taut with readiness. Ava, clinging to the packet of food, could only stare at the darkening sky, her breath shallow and quick. The storm had swallowed the world around them, and the shadows felt deeper, more oppressive. It was as though something had shifted in the air, thickening the atmosphere with an unspoken dread. "Get back," Ethan said to Ava, his voice rough with authority. But she didn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the growing noise. The cry had turned into a scream, a desperate, broken sound. The stranger's face twisted with terror. "No! No, it can't be! They're coming for us!" Ethan took a step forward, his eyes scanning the area. "Who's coming?" he demanded. The man's gaze flickered from Ethan to Ava, and then back to the woods behind them. "The scavengers. They're the ones who've taken everything. They'll take more if we're not careful. His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard, his body trembling. Ethan took in a sharp breath, his mind racing. He had heard of these scavengers, outlaws who had once been soldiers, civilians or worse, and who had now turned into ruthless marauders, preying on the weak and the vulnerable. They moved swiftly with no mercy, and they took whatever they wanted. Their presence was a mark of the world's degradation. "Ava," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the rising tension, "stay close to me. Don't move unless I say so." He gestured for the stranger to follow him, and together they backed up into a nearby building, an abandoned, half-collapsed structure that had once been part of a village. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, but it would offer some semblance of protection at least for a little while. Shadow, still alert, moved into the shadows, his keen senses searching for any sign of the threat. Ava stood close to Ethan, her face pale, her heart racing as the sound of the approaching scavengers grew louder. She hadn't realized just how dangerous the world had become until now. Her mother's stories had once seemed so far away, fairy tales of times before the war, but now they felt like a lifetime ago. The wind howled as the storm gained strength. The faint light from the few remaining pieces of the broken building flickered and faded, leaving them in near total darkness. Ethan's hand went to his radio, the small device crackling to life as he spoke. "Command, this is Ethan Cole, requesting backup. We've got scavengers moving in on our position. I repeat, scavengers." The radio hissed with static, and for a moment Ethan thought the transmission was lost. But then a voice broke through, distorted but clear. "Copy that, Cole. Hold your position. Backup is en route. Stay alert." Ethan gripped the radio tightly, a wave of frustration passing over him. The chances of backup arriving in time were slim. He knew it. They all knew it. Time was running out. Ava's voice was small, barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" Ethan's eyes softened as he glanced at her. She was just a child, too young to understand the full weight of their situation, but not naive enough to think everything would be okay. She had seen the same things he had. She had lived in the same world of destruction and fear. "We survive," he said simply. "We stay together, we protect each other, and we keep fighting. That's all we can do." As he spoke, the building creaked ominously, and Ava's eyes darted around the room, every corner now shadowed by the oncoming storm. The cries outside had stopped, but the feeling of dread remained, thick and heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise, a loud bang followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the debris outside the building. The scavengers were closer now, too close. They were here. Ethan crouched down, motioning for Ava and the stranger to get down. Shadow, ever loyal, had already taken up a defensive position near the entrance, his body coiled and ready to spring into action. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He had to act fast. His instincts told him they didn't have much time. "Stay quiet," he ordered in a low voice. "We wait for the right moment." Ava squeezed her eyes shut, her heart thudding against her chest as she heard the crunching footsteps growing closer. The fear gnawed at her, and she clutched the packet of food to her chest again, as if the tiny shred of hope it represented was all she had left to hold on to. But just as the footsteps neared the door, a shout echoed through the storm. "There they are! Get them!" The scavengers had found them. The building trembled as the first thud of heavy boots hit the ground outside. Ethan's body went rigid, his instincts screaming for him to act. Shadow, still crouched low and poised to spring, snarled under his breath, his eyes fixed on the door. Every muscle in the dog's body was taut, the raw, protective instinct that had bonded him to Ethan now fully awakened. Ava's hand tightened around the packet of food, as though it might somehow shield her from the oncoming threat. Her breath was shallow, and her small body was shaking with fear. But there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, a spark of defiance that mirrored the soldier's silent resolve. The footsteps outside grew louder, closer. The scavengers were circling, trying to find an entrance, their voices muffled but filled with malicious intent. Ethan signaled for the stranger to stay silent, but the man was already shaking, his hands clenching into fists. "We can't stay here," he hissed in panic, his eyes darting around the dim interior. "They'll find us. They'll take everything." "Not if we move fast," Ethan replied, his voice a low growl of command. His eyes scanned the room, looking for a way out, something that could offer them an advantage. He knew they had very little time, but he wouldn't let this situation slip out of control. Not again. Ava looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "What do we do?" she whispered. Ethan didn't answer right away. His mind was working quickly, calculating their options. They had only one choice: make it to the back of the building and use the rubble to climb out of sight. They couldn't fight the scavengers head-on, not without more ammo, not without backup, but they could escape. Ethan turned to Shadow, signaling the dog to move. "Stay close," he whispered to Ava, and without another word, he took a step toward the back of the building, leading them into the darkened corridor that ran along the back wall. But before they could make it very far, the door slammed open with a deafening crack, and the scavengers flooded in. "Found you!" one of them shouted, his voice raspy and filled with sick satisfaction. He was a tall man, his face twisted into a cruel sneer, his hand holding a rusted knife that glinted in the low light. The others behind him were similarly armed, their eyes gleaming with the same hunger, the same desperation. Ethan didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbing the nearest piece of broken wood he could find, and swung it with all his might at the first scavenger. The man grunted in pain as the wood made contact with his arm, and he staggered back, his knife falling to the ground with a sharp clatter. But the second scavenger was already upon them. "Ava, go!" Ethan shouted, his voice urgent. "Now!" Shadow lunged, his powerful body crashing into the legs of another scavenger, knocking him off balance. The man cursed, struggling to regain his footing, but the dog was relentless, biting and snarling. It gave Ethan the time he needed to push Ava toward the back of the building. The girl didn't hesitate. She knew what was at stake. Her small legs carried her quickly as she ducked behind the crumbling walls of the old structure. But she could hear the sounds of the fight growing louder behind her, the grunts, the shouts, the clash of metal against wood. Her heart hammered in her chest, each step feeling like a lifetime. "Ethan!" she called, but her voice was lost in the chaos. Her feet carried her faster, and she stumbled over debris, barely catching herself. Behind her, the soldier was still fighting. Ethan was a blur of motion, his every move precise, every strike calculated to protect them. But the scavengers were relentless. He couldn't hold them off forever. Just as he heard the sound of another scavenger moving behind him, Ethan turned to face him. But before he could react, a sharp pain sliced through his side, a cold, sharp knife digging into his flesh. His breath caught in his throat, and he staggered back, almost losing his footing. But Shadow was there, knocking the man away with a violent shove. The dog's teeth sank deep into the scavenger's arm, and the man screamed in pain, dropping his weapon. Ethan didn't have time to process the injury. Blood was already soaking through his shirt, but he gritted his teeth and made one final move. He pushed the scavenger to the ground and quickly moved toward the back door. "Ava!" he shouted again, his voice hoarse. The girl was already halfway across the room, and when she saw him coming, she didn't wait for him to catch up. She dove behind the pile of rubble, her small hands scrabbling to find a way out. Ethan followed, but as he reached the back door, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, more scavengers coming to finish the job. He pushed harder, reaching for Ava's outstretched hand. "Come on," he urged, his voice strained with urgency. "We can't stop now." Shadow, still growling and snapping at the nearest scavenger, gave them the time they needed to escape. Together the three of them, soldier, child, and dog, sprinted through the door, disappearing into the storm. They ran, their bodies aching, their hearts pounding with fear and determination. The world outside had turned into a battlefield, and they had no choice but to keep moving, to keep running. Because if they stopped, the scavengers would catch them, and if they didn't escape, there would be no one left to protect them. The rain lashed against their faces as they ran, the wind cutting through the night like 1,000 icy blades. Each step felt heavier than the last, but there was no time to slow down. Behind them the scavengers were closing in, their voices carried on the wind, shouting curses, demanding surrender. They didn't care who they were chasing, only that they wanted to take whatever they could. Ethan's side throbbed with pain, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. The wound wasn't deep, but it was enough to weaken him. He had no intention of letting Ava see his injury, no intention of letting her see the toll the night was taking on him. Not when she needed him more than ever. "Come on, Ava," he urged, glancing back only for a moment to make sure she was still with him. Ava, her breath coming in short gasps, was close behind. Shadow, ever vigilant, stayed at her side, his body braced as if to protect her from whatever dangers lay ahead. The dog was their shield, his growls sending a message to anyone who dared get too close. Despite the terror in her heart, Ava held on to the packet of food like a lifeline. It was all she had left, all that had kept her from falling apart, and now it seemed even more precious, her connection to the world beyond the storm, to the small glimmer of hope in the face of so much darkness. "Keep going!" Ethan shouted, his voice firm, despite the exhaustion pulling at his limbs. But as they reached the edge of the ruined town, a deafening crack echoed through the night, the unmistakable sound of a rifle shot. The bullet whizzed past them, grazing the air just inches from Ethan's head. He froze for a split second, his heart jumping into his throat. "Get down!" he barked, pulling Ava behind a broken wall of stone, his body instinctively shielding her. Shadow crouched low, growling fiercely at the unseen threat. The scavengers weren't just following them, they were hunting them. Ethan's mind raced. The shot hadn't been a warning. It had been an attempt to end them. They were no longer just prey. They were a target, and the only thing standing between them and certain death was a handful of broken walls and the sharp instincts of a soldier and his dog. Ava's eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else, something she hadn't seen before. The raw determination on Ethan's face, the fire in his eyes was enough to make her believe, if only for a moment, that they could survive. But that belief was quickly fading as the scavengers' voices grew louder, closer, their footsteps echoing through the alleyways, signaling their relentless pursuit. Ethan gritted his teeth, his fingers tight around his weapon. "Stay down," he whispered to Ava. "Do not move until I say so." Ava nodded, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't want to hide, didn't want to cower. She had spent too many nights hiding from threats she couldn't control. But this was different. This was survival. The minutes felt like hours. The storm raged on around them, but inside the silence of their hiding spot, it was as if time itself had stopped. Ethan's breathing was steady, controlled, but his eyes were alert, darting from one side to the other, calculating their next move. But as the scavengers drew closer, something changed in the air. It wasn't just the sound of their footsteps, it was the way they moved, methodical, deliberate, hunting them with cold precision. Ethan's hand tightened on the grip of his weapon. He wasn't going to let them take Ava, not without a fight. But there were too many, and they had the high ground. He had one choice left. He had to make a break for it, draw them away from Ava, give her a chance to escape. "Ava, listen to me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm going to draw them away. You run, you hear me? You run and don't stop. You find shelter and you wait for me." Her eyes filled with tears, her voice shaking. "No, Ethan, don't go. I can't leave you." "You have to," he said, his tone firm, yet filled with a quiet sadness. "You're the only thing that matters now. I'll be okay. I'll find you." She shook her head, but she knew he was right. She didn't want to be alone, not again, but the look in his eyes, the way he held himself, she knew he wouldn't let anything happen to her. He would protect her, no matter what, even if it meant sacrificing himself. With a final look, Ethan nodded toward the opening in the wall, signaling for Ava to move. She hesitated, but only for a moment, before she scrambled to her feet, clutching the packet of food tightly in her arms. Shadow followed closely, and for a moment she could have sworn she felt his presence beside her, like a guardian spirit, a protector. As she ran, Ethan watched her disappear into the darkness. And then, without looking back, he rose to his feet, taking one last look at the encroaching scavengers before slipping into the shadows. The game had changed. He had to fight to keep them alive, and he would do whatever it took. The wind howled louder as Ethan sprinted through the ruins, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the scavengers' voices growing fainter behind him, but he didn't stop, not even for a second. Every step was calculated, every breath forced into rhythm with the pounding of his heart. He needed to create distance, enough so Ava could make it out safely. He didn't know if it would work. The odds were against them. He was injured, exhausted, and outnumbered. But he couldn't afford to think about the impossible. All that mattered was Ava. She had a chance, but only if he kept them distracted. The sound of the scavengers' pursuit was getting closer. Ethan could hear them shouting to one another, scrambling in the storm, getting more desperate. But Ethan had the advantage. They were spread out, not expecting him to be this bold. They had underestimated him. That would be their mistake. He ducked behind an old, half-collapsed building, hoping the shadows would conceal him for a moment. His side burned with pain, but he gritted his teeth and steadied his breath. The knife wound was deeper than he'd realized, and it throbbed with every movement. He had to focus. He couldn't let that stop him now. There was no time to rest, no time to be weak. He checked his weapon, the weight of it grounding him, and then, without hesitation, moved forward again. He needed a way to make them scatter, something that would pull their attention away from Ava. If he could get close enough to the leader, maybe take him down quickly, the others would hesitate. The scavengers weren't far behind. Their footsteps were erratic, frantic, like hunters closing in on their prey. Ethan knew their fear. It mirrored his own. They were desperate, but that desperation would be their downfall. They'd made the mistake of thinking they could hunt down two helpless victims. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Just as he turned a corner, the scavenger leader appeared in his path, tall, rough-looking, his wild eyes scanning the night with vicious determination. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, and his hand rested on a large knife. His men followed close behind, their weapons drawn, ready for action. Ethan ducked behind a pile of debris just in time, but not before the leader spotted him. A shout echoed through the alleyway. "There he is! Get him!" Ethan didn't wait. He fired a shot, a warning shot that missed its mark, but was loud enough to make them hesitate. The leader growled, motioning for his men to move forward. "He's cornered! Take him out!" But Ethan had already made his move. As the scavengers rushed in, he slipped into the shadows again, moving quickly, keeping to the buildings to cover his escape. His mind raced through all the possibilities, all the ways he could get the upper hand. He needed to lead them further away. He needed them to think they had him. Suddenly, from a distant alley, another shot rang out. This one was followed by the unmistakable sound of a scream, and the scavengers hesitated, momentarily distracted. Ethan turned and saw a shadow in the distance, moving toward the scene. It wasn't one of the scavengers. It was a figure in a hooded cloak, moving with a sense of purpose. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a familiar face, the stranger. "Get away from him!" Ethan shouted, his voice filled with both surprise and anger. He thought the man had been left behind. He thought he was safe. But now, he was here, risking his life for Ethan's. The stranger didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled something from under his cloak, a grenade, old and rusty, but still functioning. He yanked the pin and threw it with remarkable precision. The blast that followed shook the ground beneath their feet, sending debris flying and forcing the scavengers to scatter. The explosion was enough to create the chaos Ethan needed. In the confusion, he made his move. He charged the leader, his body propelled by instinct. He ducked under a wild swing from the scavenger's knife and jabbed his elbow into the man's stomach, sending him stumbling backward. Before the man could recover, Ethan grabbed him by the arm, twisting it behind his back and slamming him into the wall with a grunt of effort. The other scavengers were momentarily thrown into chaos by the blast, but now they were regaining their footing. Ethan needed to finish this quickly. He glanced at the stranger, who was now working on securing his own weapon, preparing to take out the remaining scavengers. "Get Ava!" Ethan ordered between gritted teeth. "I'll hold them off." The stranger nodded, though hesitation flickered in his eyes. "You sure?" Ethan didn't waste another moment. He drove his elbow into the leader's throat, watching the man choke and gasp for air before finally letting him drop to the ground. Then he turned, his mind focused entirely on the remaining scavengers. As the leader crumpled, Ethan felt a pang of hope. Just a small flicker, but enough to keep him moving. Ava was out there, running, hiding, waiting for him. And he would find her. He had to. The storm raged on, the wind howling, but Ethan's focus was laser-sharp. He moved swiftly, silently, ready for the fight that was far from over. But in the back of his mind there was a small voice telling him the truth. The scavengers were only one threat. There was something far darker looming ahead. They had made it this far, but how much further could they go before the world swallowed them whole? The storm seemed to intensify with every passing minute, its fury a reflection of the chaos that swirled around them. The scavengers had scattered in the wake of the explosion, but Ethan knew it wouldn't last long. They would regroup, and they would come back, angrier, more desperate. But that wasn't his concern right now. His priority was Ava, and he needed to find her. The stranger had disappeared into the shadows, likely following Ethan's order to search for her, but Ethan couldn't shake the gnawing sense of urgency that gripped him. The blast had done its job, but it was only a temporary reprieve. The scavengers would return with a vengeance. He had to move fast. Blood seeped slowly from the wound in his side, but it was manageable for now. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not in front of these ruthless men who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. He had no choice but to keep pushing forward, even if it meant pushing past his own limits. Ethan pushed forward, his feet sinking into the mud as he navigated the broken streets of the once thriving town. It was a ghost of what it had been, its buildings reduced to rubble and its roads cracked and overgrown. But somewhere in this devastation, Ava was hiding. Somewhere she was waiting for him. The wind howled like a creature in agony, but Ethan focused on the path ahead. He couldn't let the storm distract him. He couldn't let anything distract him. Not now. A sudden rustle to his left snapped him out of his thoughts. He spun around, his weapon raised, ready for whatever threat might be lurking in the darkness. His heart beat faster, and his senses sharpened. But then, from the shadows, a familiar figure emerged. It was the stranger, his face covered in dirt and sweat, his eyes wide with panic. "She's gone!" the man shouted, his voice hoarse. I couldn't find her. I've searched everywhere. She's not here, Ethan." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His stomach twisted into knots. He'd thought that maybe, just maybe, the stranger would have found her, would have led her to safety. But now his worst fear was realized. Ava was missing, and with every passing moment the chance of finding her grew slimmer. "No," Ethan said, his voice low and harsh, almost as if he were trying to convince himself. "She has to be here. She's close." But deep down he knew they were running out of time. The scavengers weren't far behind, and they weren't going to stop. Ava was alone, and if he didn't find her now, it might be too late. "I'll keep looking," the stranger said, his eyes darting nervously around. You should go back to the hideout. It's safer." Ethan shook his head. "We don't have time for that. We're going back together. We're not splitting up." The stranger opened his mouth to argue, but Ethan cut him off with a sharp glance. "Do you want to die out here alone, or do you want to make sure she's safe?" The stranger looked at Ethan for a long moment, as if weighing his options. Then, with a resigned nod, he agreed. "Fine, let's go." They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows and staying as low to the ground as possible. The storm seemed to provide them with some cover, but it also made the streets slippery and treacherous. They had to be careful, or they would risk giving themselves away. Ethan's heart pounded as they crept through the wreckage of the town. Every crunch of debris beneath their feet felt like an explosion in his ears. He couldn't afford to make a noise, not now. Every minute they spent searching brought them closer to being found by the scavengers. Then from ahead came a small, almost imperceptible sound, a faint rustle in the wind. Ethan's heart stopped. "Ava?" he whispered urgently, his voice barely audible above the storm. There was no answer at first, only the howl of the wind and the distant sound of footsteps, but then a small voice, shaky and barely a whisper, reached his ears. "Ethan!" His heart surged with relief. "Ava!" he called, his voice cracking. "Ava, where are you?" The voice came again, this time louder and more desperate. I'm here, Ethan." Ethan rushed toward the sound, his steps quickening. He was almost there, just a few more steps, and then, through the veil of rain and wind, he saw her. Ava was crouched beneath the remnants of a collapsed wall, her small body huddled tightly against the rubble, trying to shield herself from the storm. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear, but there was also a flicker of hope there, a flicker that told him she knew he was coming for her. Without a second thought, Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, pulling her into his arms. The weight of the moment hit him, the relief of finding her, the urgency of getting her out of here. "I found her," Ethan said breathlessly to the stranger who had caught up behind him. "Now let's get out of here." Ava clung to him, her small hands gripping the fabric of his coat. I'm scared, Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I know," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you're safe now. I'm not letting anything happen to you. You're going to be okay." The wind continued to howl, and the storm raged around them, but for the first time that night, Ethan felt a sense of peace. They had found each other, and no matter what happened, they would face it together. But the storm wasn't the only danger closing in. The scavengers were still out there, and Ethan knew they wouldn't stop until they had everything they wanted. But this time, he wouldn't let them take what mattered most. The storm raged on, the wind cutting through the night with unrelenting force. But in that moment, as Ethan held Ava close to him, it felt like the world had momentarily stopped spinning. The fear in her eyes, the desperation that had followed him throughout the night, now, it seemed, just a little bit smaller, a little more bearable. They were together, and for that brief, fleeting moment, it felt like they could survive anything. But Ethan knew better than to let his guard down. They weren't safe yet. The scavengers were still out there, and they were closing in, The storm would hide them for only so long. The stranger, still standing just behind them, shifted uneasily, his eyes scanning the darkened streets. "We need to keep moving. They're not far off, and we don't have much time." Ethan nodded, tightening his grip on Ava. "You're right," he said. "We can't stay here." He helped Ava to her feet, his side throbbing with pain from the wound, but he ignored it. There was no time to stop. He looked down at the girl who had wrapped her arms around his waist, her small frame trembling from both the cold and the fear. "You stay close, Ava," Ethan instructed, his voice firm but reassuring. "We're going to make it. Just stay with me." Ava nodded silently, her wide eyes focused on him. There was no more time for words. The urgency was suffocating, and they needed to move before the scavengers found them. Ethan looked to the stranger. "We go through the alley. Stay low. Keep moving. We'll head for the old church on the hill. It's the safest place we can get to right now." The stranger hesitated, his brow furrowed in confusion. "The church? But it's abandoned. We'll be sitting ducks." "It's the only place we have," Ethan said, his voice hard with finality. "We can't outrun them forever. We need a place to regroup, to defend ourselves." With that, the three of them set off, moving quickly but cautiously through the ruins. The alleyway was narrow, filled with debris and broken glass. They kept to the shadows, their movements swift but deliberate. The storm continued to rage around them, making it harder to hear the sounds of pursuit, but they knew, deep down, that they were being hunted. The wind howled, pushing them forward, but also hiding their movements. The church, with its tall steeple looming in the distance, was their only hope now. If they could make it there, they might have a chance. As they neared the edge of the alley, a sudden noise froze them in their tracks. Footsteps. They weren't their own. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and his hand instinctively went to the gun at his side. Shadow growled low beside him, his ears twitching. The scavengers were closer than ever. They had to move. Without hesitation, Ethan pulled Ava close to him, his voice barely a whisper. "Run! Now!" They dashed forward, their footsteps muffled by the storm, the sound of their movement drowned out by the howling wind. Ethan pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain in his side, the fatigue that threatened to slow him down. Ava's small hands gripped his jacket tightly, her breath quick and ragged against his back. The church was closer now, the looming silhouette of its broken doors a symbol of what they needed to survive. But as they reached the steps of the church, the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked sent a jolt of terror through Ethan's body. "Stop!" a voice shouted from behind them, rough and cold. "You won't get away!" Ethan spun around just in time to see the scavenger leader, his eyes wild with fury, stepping into view. He was flanked by two others, both armed with rifles. The rest of the scavengers weren't far behind. The leader sneered, his weapon aimed directly at them. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" His voice was bitter, filled with a cruel satisfaction. "I'm going to enjoy this." Ethan's heart raced, but his eyes locked onto the leaders, his resolve hardening. He had no intention of going down without a fight. Not with Ava at his side. He glanced at the stranger. "Get inside, now!" Without waiting for a response, Ethan pushed Ava forward toward the church's heavy doors. But the scavenger leader wasn't done. With a swift movement, he took a step forward, raising his rifle, ready to fire. "Move!" Ethan shouted. A split second before the shot could ring out, Shadow lunged forward, throwing himself into the path of the bullet. The dog let out a yelp as the bullet tore through his side, but he didn't stop. He kept moving, knocking the rifle away from the leader's aim and forcing him off balance. Ethan didn't think, he acted. He rushed forward, his hand grabbing the leader's rifle and twisting it from his grasp. With a grunt of effort, he drove his knee into the leader's chest, sending him crashing into the ground. The two remaining scavengers took a step back, clearly unsure whether to engage or flee. But Ethan wasn't waiting for them to make a decision. In one swift motion, he pulled his gun from his side, aimed at the ground, and fired, a shot that rang through the storm and sent a clear message. If they wanted to keep going, they would need to think twice. The scavengers froze. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated the bond between a soldier and his dog. "Get inside now," Ethan shouted to the stranger, and Ava, his voice urgent. The two of them didn't hesitate. They darted into the church, disappearing through the doors. But Ethan didn't follow just yet. He stayed where he was, his gaze locked on the scavengers who were now backing away, their weapons lowered but still in hand. He knew this wasn't over, not yet. But the storm had given them a brief window of opportunity, and that was all they needed. With a final glance at the retreating scavengers, Ethan turned and bolted toward the doors of the church, the weight of the night bearing down on him. Inside the church, Ava was waiting by the broken pews, her small body trembling, but safe. She had made it. They had made it. Ethan took a moment to catch his breath, his side burning, his heart still racing, but the worst was behind them. They had made it this far, and now they had to survive.